Right. Well, thank you very much, Jack, and Anka, and all of the organisers, and thank you all for turning up. It's always a delight to speak to people at Oxford. I've been, of course, to Oxford many times and always had a great reception. And in fact, some of the people who organised some of my previous visits are on the call as well. So thank you to them for all of your efforts over the years. So, of course, the audience tonight, it covers a wide spectrum in terms of how much you already know about the work that I and my foundation do. And so I have the difficulty that I need to give a lot of introductory material, but also try to keep the rest of you entertained. But of course, the good thing is that we do have a lot of time at the end for Q&A, so I don't feel too bad about that. Those of you who find it a bit soporific to listen to what I have to say over the first part of this talk, please keep patience because there will be more. So let me just start with this, because of course, the word longevity is now used very freely by people in this community. We very much are happy to talk about this as what we work on. But in fact, it's not what we work on, and it's actually important to say so. Not necessarily to say so to each other, but to the wider world. Because that the overwhelming majority of humanity do not appreciate the value of this work. And that is fundamentally because they focus on the longevity aspect, the idea of living a long time, and they are unable to shake the assumption that it's all about keeping people alive in a poor state of health, a state of health that's characteristic of elderly people today. Now, we know that that's not the case. We know that the longevity consequences of our work are actually a side effect, and that the real work that we're doing is on health, on maintaining the health of people who were born a long time ago. Yes, it's going to be a big side effect because, let's face it, these days, at least in the industrialized world and increasingly in the developing world too, most people die from being sick, and most people get sick from being old. So sure, if we actually succeed in all of this, we're going to have a lot of increase in the average time that people live. And absolutely, that's a side effect to celebrate. It's a good side effect. But we really always, when we're talking to the great unwashed out there, we have to emphasize this. We have to make sure not to let them get focused on the idea of working on longevity state. Somebody just unmuted themselves, but I guess you got it under control. All right, so let me just briefly explain what I mean by this advocacy problem, because there may be many people on this call who have not had the misfortune to spend the last 20 years the way I have, talking to people who claim that this is really not something we should be working on. The consequences of focusing on longevity are that you forget about the health aspect. And people think about things like, oh dear, well, we put all the people, or won't dictators live forever, or won't it be, or doesn't death give meaning to life? You know, things that they don't exactly say about Alzheimer's disease or cancer or whatever. So focusing people back on the health aspect is really important. And even though it is actually very straightforward to point out that these alleged difficulties, these potential problems that might be created as a consequence of solving the problem we have today, the problem of aging, even though it's easy to show that those problems will not in fact occur, nevertheless, one needs more than that. One needs to point out that even if they did occur, that they would not be anywhere near as severe as the problem we have today, the problem of 100,000 people every day dying of aging. So this is something that I just wanted to get all of you oriented about, not because I think necessarily anyone on this call really needs to be told this, but you do need to be told to tell it. You need to have this constantly in your mind whenever you are engaging in advocacy in this space. All right, now for the real content. So I was trained as a computer scientist, and I think like an engineer. I think about technology and pioneering technology especially as something that needs to be tackled systematically. And that's actually rather different. Well, but it's a different kind of systematic than what people do in basic science. I'll come back to that shortly. But for me, the biggest thing that we need to start from is asking the right questions about aging. And the biggest question of all is, why is it so difficult to deal with medically? Because let's face it, 200 years ago, more than 1/3 of babies, even in the world's wealthiest countries, would die before the age of 1. And there was plenty of death later on in life and childbirth and so on. And we figured out how to eliminate all of that pretty much completely. And we did it with really simple mechanisms, really simple methods, like just figuring out that hygiene is a good idea, stuff like that. So, we really think we should wonder why this is true. Somebody in chat mentioned that I am intermittently breaking up. If that's still true, then somebody please tell me, and I'll try and figure out what to do. However, coming back. So the thing is, what's different about the health problems of late life, which somehow causes the, health problems of late life not to have been amenable to the same simple medical approaches that have worked so well against almost all infectious diseases? Most people think that this is the answer. They think that it's just because so many things go wrong with us late in life. By the way, don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. It's just the idea is simply, of course, that there is a lot of stuff happening and it all happens at more or less the same time. And so these phenomena, they interact, they exacerbate each other. Maybe it's just the sheer complexity that is the basis of the difficulty. And that is part of the problem. I'm not saying it's not. But it's actually not the main reason why the health problems of late life are so much more difficult for medicine to bring under control. So in order to introduce the main reason, I'm going to start with a definition of aging. And here again, it's fairly crazy that I would need to do this, right? Because aging has, after all, been the #1 preoccupation of humanity since the beginning of civilization. So you'd think we would have come up with an agreed definition of it, but no, if you ask 10 people what aging is, you'll get 10 different answers at least. So I'm going to start with this definition. And this definition has two purposes. First of all, of course, to get us all on the same page and make sure that you understand what I'm saying for the rest of the talk, but also because it demystifies aging. This is a way of helping you to understand that aging is not some crazy enigma that we absolutely don't understand. Not at all. We really do understand aging, in essence, in a pretty fundamental way. So what am I saying on this slide? All I'm saying is that aging is the combination of two processes. The process on the left that goes on throughout life, and I mean literally throughout life, starting before we're born, and then the process on the right that kicks off later in life. So what are these processes? The one on the left is something that happens even to simple man-made machines like cars. Any machine with moving parts, whether or not we call it alive, it performs processes that generate damage, that generate changes to the underlying structure of the machine. Actually, those changes are harmless, and that's because the machine is set up. But the reason why it's appropriate to use the word damage to denote those changes is that the body is only set up, the machine is only set up to tolerate a certain amount. Eventually, that amount is exceeded, and you have enough of that change to kick off the right-hand process, the progressive decline in function of the machine. So in a living organism, metabolism, that's the word that, of course, denotes the entire network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next. Excuse me. That process, that network of processes generates damage. The damage eventually exceeds what the body is set up to tolerate, and we start to get the pathologies of late life emerging and progressing. That's all that aging is. So now, why is it so important to have that definition? Well, a large part of the reason it's so important is because people get this question wrong. If you ask people, in what ways can somebody get sick? They will typically give an answer that can be approximated by what I'm showing you on this table here. they'll say, well, okay, there's infectious diseases, that's column 1. Then there's genetic diseases, things that a small number of us inherit, that's column 2. Then there's the big one, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, like Alzheimer's, almost all cancers, atherosclerosis, all the things I put up in tiny font earlier on, right? And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this other 4th category called aging itself, which consists of these perhaps not very well defined things like frailty. And, it's like the way one thinks about it, the way most people think about it is that it's completely different from diseases. And it's like it's implicitly off limits to medicine. And that's a big problem because, of course, if it's off limits to medicine, you're not going to try and develop medicine to deal with it. But the thing is that this description of ways to be sick has a huge but very important error in it. Here is the consequence of the error. If you think about the ways to be sick in the way that I just described, then your focus on column 3, on the pathologies of late life, the diseases of late life, is going to be rather similar to your approach to column 1, infections. Essentially, you're going to try to eliminate these pathologies from the body. You're going to try to cure Alzheimer's disease or whatever. Sounds good, but what it amounts to is what I'm showing you now, that you're attacking the pathologies of late life directly. And you don't even have to think about this diagram. It's just immediately obvious from just looking at this little picture that that's never going to work, because these pathologies are consequences of something that is accumulating as a side effect of being alive. And therefore, by definition, any type of medicine that goes after the pathologies of late life directly is going to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. It's brain dead. So, of course, the next question is, why are we still fixated on this approach? Surely we should try something else. Now, of course, one potential answer is, well, maybe there isn't anything else, and I'll explain shortly that that's not the case. But really the answer is the mistake I just explained. Here's the corrected version of that table I showed you a moment ago. And if you look closely, you'll see that all the columns are exactly the same as before. The only thing I have changed is the location of that big, thick black line. And that communicates 2 things. First of all, it communicates that we should not be thinking of column 3 as if it were pretty much the same as column 1. There is no reason to suppose that the same kind of medicine would work for the 2 types of ways to be sick. But the other thing, perhaps even more important, that moving the black line communicates, is that there is really no difference between column 3 and column 4. In fact, the difference is purely semantic. Column 3 consists of the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, and that is all. Once you understand that, it becomes a lot easier to see that there are indeed alternative ways to go about addressing the things in column 3 and indeed in column 4, because of course, column 3 is very much not off limits to medicine, and so column 4 can't be either. So what I've said so far is not new. In fact, more than a century ago, a few people started to think vaguely this way. They started to realize that geriatric medicine was never going to work, and that we needed to be more preventative. We needed to intervene earlier on in the chain of events. And so that's where the field of gerontology came from. And of course, it was inspired by the living world, by the fact that in nature, we see an enormous amount of variation between different species in the rate at which damage accumulates, in the therefore the rate of aging. And therefore it was hoped that maybe if we study that variation really hard, then eventually we will figure out enough about it to be able to design interventions that will allow metabolism to run more cleanly. In other words, to generate damage more slowly. If we could do that, then fantastic. We are postponing the point at which damage actually reaches this threshold level that causes pathologies to emerge. Great. But not so great, because in fact, we have not succeeded at all in the past century in postponing aging by this kind of method. Why not? Well, ultimately, it comes down to something that any of you on the call who understand a bit of biology will already know, namely, metabolism is really rather complicated. This is, what I'm showing you, of course, is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. And any of you who've ever written software will immediately see that this is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. You know, there is absolutely no way we're going to be able to unpick it, creation of damage, without at the same time, you know, stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. And of course, I'm totally understating the difficulty here. This is not just a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. The real problem is it's a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, which any biologist will tell you is totally dwarfed by the astronomical amount that we don't know about how biology works. And even that's, you know, ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So it's completely hopeless. And by the 1960s, 70s, people who studied the biology of aging had more or less accepted that. And it had become pretty much unacceptable to even talk about doing research that was geared towards eventually postponing aging. Aging was, you know, gerontologists back then were a bit like seismologists. They understood that the thing they study is bad for you, but they had no aspiration to really doing anything about it. You know, just it would get out of the way. And so, you know, what can we do? You know, this is a pretty sad story so far. But luckily, there's a third approach. There is a completely different way to achieve our goal. So let's remember what our goal is, as defined again by this definition of aging. Our goal is simply to separate metabolism from pathology, to you know, allow metabolism to continue happening. In other words, allow people to carry on being alive without the emergence of the health problems of late life. Right? That's all it's about. So we've established that we cannot break the link between metabolism and pathology by breaking the link between damage and pathology. And we also can't do it by breaking the link between metabolism and damage. But the maintenance approach, or the damage repair approach, we can call it, it's another way of doing it. We can leave those two component processes alone by just separating them from each other. And what that means is we go in and periodically eliminate the damage. We restore the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body to at least closer to what it was at an earlier age. We repair damage and restore that structure. And that, by definition, is going to keep our body in the zone that it is set up to tolerate, and not to have the pathology of late life emerge. Some crazy things are appearing on my screen. I have no idea why. Anyway, so yes, so this is the maintenance approach. And I call it the common sense approach. Is that arrogant? Well, I don't think so, because let's face it, we already do it successfully. What I'm showing you here now is a car that's more than 100 years old. I mentioned earlier that the definition of aging that I've given you today is actually pretty much indistinguishable from the definition that you could use if you wanted to define aging of a simple man-made machine. And here it is. This car is more than 100 years old. Key point is it was not designed to last 100 years. It was designed to last maybe 10 or 15 years at the outside. And that shows you that preventative maintenance works, so long as it is sufficiently comprehensive. Most cars don't last this long because we only do the amount of maintenance on them that the law requires. But this car has benefited from having owners who did more than that, and it works. This car is working just as well as when it was built. So the idea is to do exactly the same thing. Aging is not an emergent phenomenon of biology, the way that, you know, consciousness is. It's ultimately the same thing for any machine, whether it's living or not living. Comprehensive preventative maintenance is already demonstrated to work on simple machines, so it ought also to work on complicated machines like the human body. So the only thing that remains for me to explain is how we can actually do this. And that's potentially a problem, because let's face it, I've already emphasized how complicated metabolism is and also how complicated pathology is. So one might expect that the damage in the middle actually is also really, really complicated, which means that even though the damage repair approach is the common sense approach, nevertheless, it may not be practical, and we may not actually have a way to go. But of course, the fact that I'm talking to you today is the answer to that. It turns out that yes, damage is complicated in the human body, but it's not unmanageably complicated. First of all, though, I want to address something that many of you may have heard of, because it is a big theme within gerontology and indeed within the emerging gerontology longevity industry. And what it comes down to is tricking the body to think that it's being starved, to think that it's in a famine. Famine is a phenomenon that, of course, animals experience in the wild periodically and have done since the beginning of life. If you do, your offspring are going to die before they have their own offspring. They're going to starve to death. So it's best to hunker down and engage your metabolic priorities in staying alive. And that's possible. It turns out that having kids expends energy, no surprise. But if you expend that energy in a different way, you can slow down the amount of damage that accumulates. And this happens. So if you starve mice or rats in the laboratory, they live longer. This was discovered nearly a century ago. And, it's not terribly good for humans because humans really like eating, but maybe we could develop drugs that would somehow simulate this, trick the body into thinking it was being starved when it isn't. And sure enough, those drugs can be developed. They do exist. And it's not as effective as rejuvenation, but it's a hell of a lot easier to implement than damage repair. So, it makes sense that there should be a focus on this. And there is. But we need both, because it turns out that long-lived species like humans do not actually get all that much benefit out of starvation, or indeed simulation of starvation. If they did, then we'd be able to get decades of extra life this way. But as it is, it seems we can only get a year or two if we're lucky. So we definitely need both. And that's all I want to say about simulating famine today. I'm going to focus on rejuvenation. So back to complexity. So as I said, damage in the human body is complex, but it's not unmanageably complex. And the key thing I want to emphasize is the classification that I'm showing you here. This classification is into just 7 categories. Now, I'm not saying that there are only 7 different types of damage. What I'm saying here is that the many, many different types of damage that accumulate in the body can be classified in this way. Now, that itself is not useful because, there's plenty of ways to put 1,000 things into 7 boxes. The useful thing is the right-hand side of this table, which describes how we would do the damage repair. And so what you're seeing here really on this table is that this classification allows us to identify and describe generic therapies. We only need these 7 different types of damage repair to fix any of the types of damage. So if I just for illustration talk more about the first one, cell loss. What is that? It's when cells die and they are not automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Now, of course, different cells different organs have different types of cells, and you need different types of stem cell therapy to replace those cells. But still, all stem cell therapies have a great deal in common. So once you've got a couple of them working for a couple of different organs, getting the next one working is a great deal easier and faster. That's really the utility of this classification. It allows us to organize and modularize our approach to developing these damage repair therapies. And before I go on, let me emphasize the bottom line here. It looks like this classification really is comprehensive and exhaustive. I've been challenging my colleagues for nearly 20 years now to break it, to come up with a type of damage that does not naturally fit into this classification, and it hasn't happened. I'm still getting away with this. So this way of doing things is standing the test of time. And my slides are stuck. Here we go. Furthermore, it's not just talk. As we've mentioned earlier, I have the good fortune to be the Chief Science Officer of a foundation that was created around this idea. And we've done research over the past quite a long time now, more than a decade, which has led to some real breakthroughs. We've published quite a lot in the scientific literature. I'm just picking out these 4 papers as highlights because these are papers that really launched whole new fields that were completely stuck, and we made the fundamental breakthroughs that allowed them to really start moving again across a very diverse range of types of damage. And now this idea has become very mainstream. When I first started talking about comprehensive damage repair as an approach to combating aging, most people were so, surprised by it that they didn't really even think of it as a scientific proposal. They thought that it was never going to work. It was just completely impractical. But as people understood more about what I was saying and about the technologies that might be used to actually implement this damage repair, it kind of caught on gradually over the years. And for the past decade, it's been really quite accepted. I'm highlighting that by this paper here, which came out 7 years ago, and which ended up being by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging of the past decade. And that it's basically a restatement of the exact same concept. They split aging into 9 categories instead of 7, but that's not because they had, different things that I'd overlooked. It was just a different way of doing the subdividing. And they have the corresponding damage repair therapies on the right-hand side. So this is just one of a number of different restatements of the same concept that have been out there over the past few years. So what does this mean? Well, one huge thing that it means, and which I'm not going to talk about much today because, of course, this is an academic group, is the private sector. The investor community has started getting interested in all of this. One benefit of that is that we at SENS Research Foundation have been able to create spin-out startup companies. So the foundation is a charity, what's in the US called a 501c3. So, that's great. People who give us money, they get tax benefits. But at the end of the day, donors don't write such big checks as investors do. So it has been extremely valuable to us that over the past 5 years especially, people have been coming along who have allowed us to spin out our various projects, 6 of them now, into startup companies that have been able to attract much better funding than what we could provide philanthropically. And these projects are therefore moving a lot faster than they were. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just what we've spun out. But in addition to that, there are masses and masses of companies that have sprung up in parallel with us, funded by the same kinds of groups. And this slide here is really just almost a joke now because it's so incomplete. If you want a reasonably comprehensive coverage of the state of the private sector in this space now, go to the website that you're seeing at the bottom right of this slide, agingbiotech.info, which was set up as a public service by one of the more active investors in this space. This investment is worldwide. The companies are worldwide. Of course, there is an emphasis in the US, but by no means the only place. I should, since I'm talking to a group at Oxford, I should talk specifically about Juvenescence, which was co-founded by a very prominent investor, Jim Mellon, who went to Oxford, went to Oriel, and indeed who made a philanthropic donation of, I think, $1 million to Oriel to fund various people, including Lynn Cox, who I think spoke to this group already or is speaking next week or something. So Oxford already is very much a prominent player in this space. But yeah, it's a huge and exponentially growing sector right now. So I said I would talk about COVID, so I will. And this comes back to what I started on, the advocacy side of things. The private sector is playing an enormous and increasing role in this space, but it's not the whole story. SENS Research Foundation is still a non-profit, and we're not in any position to be, declaring victory and closing down anytime soon, because there's plenty of work that still needs to be done that is not investable. And indeed, public money still exceeds the private investment sector by some large factor in terms of the amount of money going in. So we need to change public policy. We need people who make decisions about the spending of taxpayers' money to understand the value of this work. And it's possible that the current pandemic will provide a vehicle to allow that to happen. We all know that COVID-19 is particularly bad for the elderly. Now, of course, that's not new. The seasonal flu is bad for the elderly. Most infections are more dangerous for the elderly than they are for the young. But it's particularly extreme for COVID-19. And insofar as people who are younger are affected, it's mostly those who have simply started to get the health problems of late life at an earlier age. They've got, pre-existing chronic progressive conditions. But here's the thing. Despite the fact that young adults, by and large, are almost entirely unaffected by COVID, they may get it, but they're definitely going to recover. Nevertheless, the young adult population of the world is putting up with extraordinarily onerous limitations on their lives. So why? Why are they putting up with it? The only explanation is that they actually care about the elderly. Now, that's rather important because the elderly, at least if you listen to them, they don't really care very much about themselves. That's the difficulty that we have as advocates in this field, is that longevity research is pretty much unique in that the people who are suffering from our inability to do what we'd like to do don't complain much. They are not their own advocates. They prefer to have medicine prioritized for the young. They feel the young have more to gain or something, which of course is totally circular, right? So what we now see is that there are votes in longevity research. It does make sense for governments to put taxpayers' money into keeping the elderly healthy. Quite apart from the economic argument that that money will actually save money, it will pay for itself in no time at all because aging is so expensive even when we didn't have a pandemic. So for those of you who, maybe your parents are in Parliament, anything like that, anyone who has contact with people who make decisions in the corridors of power, now is the time to be making this case. I'm doing my best to make it. I'm not alone. In fact, the UK is leading the way in this. There's an organisation called the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which is particularly vocal at the moment. And I encourage you to look them up and to get involved with them if you can. So I'll stop there and just mention that I wrote this book quite some time ago, back in 2007, actually. People keep saying, oh, please write a sequel, but there's not really much need to, because the progress that's happened over the past decade or more is pretty much the progress that we predicted it would be. Defeat of aging. It's still the same 7 categories of damage that it was before. It's still the same approaches to fixing them. The approaches have gone, have made a lot of progress, but it's the progress that we predicted. So this book is still very much relevant and I recommend it. But now I'd be happy to start answering questions. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Aubrey, for that enlightening presentation. And I can see a few questions in the chat. So now is the time, if you have some questions for Dr. de Grey, post them in the chat. And there's a couple of questions that we've received in advance by email. So I'll begin with those. So Isabel asks, what do you think young people should do apart from fasting, watching their diet and exercising to slow down aging? i.e., does it make sense to use supplements as a 20-year-old?
I would say it doesn't make sense. In fact, I would say that even as and when we develop bona fide rejuvenation therapies, it will not really make sense for those in their 20s to use them. If we, in fact, arguably the merits of doing something now are greater than the merits of doing something later, simply because today we don't have rejuvenation therapies and all we can do is slow things down. But as I mentioned, we can only slow things down very slightly, which means that it's probably better to wait so as not to have to experiment. Nobody wants to be the first person to take any medical treatment. You want to make sure that, that you get the bugs out first, so to speak, that these things are safe. And of course, this is a problem with preventative medicine in general, that it could do more harm than good if you're not yet sick. So I would say the right time to be thinking about intervening is in middle age, you have to make a trade-off between the safety and how soon you're going to get sick, how much more difficult it's going to be to bring you back, to actually rejuvenate you later on.
Great, thank you, Aubrey. And a very fitting answer for that applies to someone like myself who thinks about the extent to which I should think about personal longevity versus trying to progress the field. So it seems like as a young person, you would definitely suggest the second category of trying to progress the field, and then once the de-risking has been done, then consider the supplementation. So that's very useful. So
yeah, and actually, let me give another answer to this question, because this is an important thing that that anyone with a good education should be able to understand. Just mathematically, it doesn't really make much sense to focus on one's own longevity anyway, because how much difference are you going to make? You might bring forward the development of new therapies, the defeat of aging, but I mean, I'm probably making more difference in that regard than anyone else in the world. And even I, in my most arrogant moments, will not argue that I'm bringing the defeat of aging forward by more than about 5 years. So that's going to make only a rather small difference to the likelihood that I will make the cut. Whereas, if I look at the humanitarian impact of my work, every single day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, I'm saving 100,000 lives. And that's quite easy to get out of bed for.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it really, I guess it fits into the sort of effective altruism mindset of trying to do the most good. And as someone sort of aligned with the EA mindset as well, I'm definitely in favor of aging from an EA perspective. Okay, so the next question comes from Shirag, who is asking, I've heard some comments online that believe you have been somewhat over-optimistic about your timeframes for the development of rejuvenation therapies happening within the next 20 years. I just want to ask what specifically has made you confident about your 20-year timeframe prediction?
Yes, so of course, it's perfectly reasonable for experts to agree to disagree about timeframes. But there are a couple of other aspects that I think I should probably emphasize here. The first one is that when I started talking about all of this 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of the people who felt that I was being drastically over-optimistic were speaking from a position of incomplete understanding of what I was saying. I would generally find that the experts in this field were experts only in one or two components of what I was talking about, of the various damage repair technologies. And maybe they would think that I was being slightly over-optimistic about the areas that they understood well, that they were expert on. But they would feel that I was being drastically over-optimistic about the ones that they didn't know about. And, of course, I knew that that was unjustified because they didn't know about that stuff, but it didn't stop them from having their opinion, which is a bit of a shame, really. The other aspect that is still true, even though that part has gone away and people do understand that in the near term, the kind of time frame predictions I make are not all that unreasonable, is that in the longer term, I talk about this thing called longevity escape velocity, where basically we reach a point, perhaps quite soon, like in the next 10 or 15 years, when we are still not by any means able to repair all damage, but we can repair enough of it to stay one step ahead of the problem because we can improve the comprehensiveness of those therapies faster than time is passing. And because I do not say how we will do that, because of course I don't know, it's the distant future, a lot of my colleagues are very uncomfortable with that whole idea. I think that's like illogical. I think it makes sense to understand that even though we don't know how we're going to do it, the likelihood that we will do it is still very high. But still, that's one part of the optimism aspect. And the third thing that really is an enormous part of this is political. I have had the great good fortune to arise to a position of some prominence and influence in this field without having had to sell my soul to peer review, to have to fund my work through government grants. If you are not that lucky, if that's how you fund your work, then the very most important thing to do is to avoid any possibility that somebody can accuse you of being irresponsible, of getting the public's hopes up unduly, because that's an easy, us-covering way to say no to your grant application. And people are, of course, on the committees that evaluate grants are always looking for reasons to say no because there's never enough money to go around. So until now, until the last couple of years, it's been more or less impossible for any of my expert colleagues to go out and say anything like what I said. But that is now changing. I should probably mention my good friend David Sinclair, who wrote a book last year whose subtitle was Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. 10 years ago, he could not have written a book with that kind of title and kept his job, because he's a professor at Harvard, you see. So yeah, things are changing.
Yeah, terrific. And yeah, it's fantastic for the field that I guess to supplement your efforts, someone like David Sinclair with a now almost like a cult-like following is also promulgating a similar message, which is really great for the field in general. Okay, so a few people have asked about this recent study from Israel about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which you would have come across. And I'll preface this by saying that my own reading of this study is that to be a little bit hesitant, given that there was a lack of control group and that the authors didn't propose a mechanism by which the hyperbaric therapy could actually slow telomere attrition. But I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on this recent study from Tel Aviv.
Right, yes. So this is an interesting study. The longer one spends in this field, the more one gets used to the fact that studies that are slightly interesting get enormously overhyped in the media. And of course, the researchers, through no fault of their own, tend to acquiesce in that exaggeration because it helps them to get money and so on. So that's fine. But yeah, I mean, so the limitations are many and varied of this study. First of all, as you said, there was no control group, but that's kind of okay because it was a longitudinal study. They looked before and after. And because they did see genuine rejuvenation, in other words, not just slowing of telomere shortening, but lengthening of telomeres, and also reduction in the number of T cells that exhibited the kind of T cell version of senescence, which is normally called anergy. So this is pretty interesting. And it definitely seems to be a significant and robust result. However, what it says, yes, you say, there's no real mechanism given. We do know that senescent T cells have short telomeres, so the two things do go together. If the hyperbaric oxygen is somehow eliminating the senescent T cells, then that's good. And we also know that it seems to have an effect on other lymphocytes, B cells and natural killer cells, though there was no measure of their senescence per se, there was only measure of their telomeres. So yeah, all in all, exciting stuff up to a point. The other question we have, however, is whether it's entirely a good thing to remove these so-called senescent T cells, because in contrast to regular senescent cells, which are undoubtedly bad for you and they secrete nasty things, senescent T cells actually do a bunch of good stuff still, as well as doing potentially bad stuff. So, there's a lot to be examined here. But as an initial foray into a new area of potential intervention, it's certainly promising. It deserves further study.
Yeah, okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. So maybe I just want to add a question just to follow up on that, because it got me thinking today, to what extent do you think people like us who want to bring attention to this field, to what extent do you think we're justified in exaggerating or kind of using some sales strategies, you could say, to bring more attention to the field, given that, as we all know, the field urgently needs more funding? Because I guess in the media, some people have criticized you for your claims about the first people living to 150 or 1,000 being alive today, but I'm wondering how you make that balance between maintaining scientific credibility, but also getting people interested in anti-aging or rejuvenation biotechnologies.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult thing to balance. And of course, it's different in different fields. In this particular field, actually, my own personal beliefs are a good deal more extreme than what I tend to say. So, when I talk about people living on average to 1,000 as a result of the achievement of longevity, escape velocity, I'm deliberately ignoring the fact that at the same time as we make progress against aging, we will be also you were born, like road accidents with self-driving cars and so on, which means that actually, I'm perfectly sure that it's going to be the average lifespans of people who are in college today will be a very great deal more than 1,000. You know, 1,000 is quite enough to scare people, so I don't even bother to say any of that. I think the important thing is not to exaggerate when one doesn't need to only say what one can robustly justify. Then, of course, there will be people who just don't like the answer and they will refuse to listen, but that's a good deal easier to manage than people showing that you are actually exaggerating when you don't need to.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it makes me think a bit more carefully about how I go about promoting the field in a tactful and appealing way. So we have another submitted question, which is a little bit tangential, but I think in the context of COVID, it may still be something that you're interested in answering. John is asking about, he says he's interested that vaccines offered for COVID claim to have a 90 to 95 success rate. Could similar vaccines be developed to eliminate flu and the common cold? Both are also coronaviruses, but not generally considered killers. And then there's a follow-up. Would pharmaceutical firms be likely to produce such vaccines since each year they would make considerable revenue over-the-counter cold and flu, from over-the-counter cold and flu remedies?
Yeah, well, of course, this is more an immunology question than a gerontology question. But certainly, certainly vaccine development has received a big boost from COVID. And a good thing too, because there's massive research that's not getting enough money that could be the genesis of much better vaccines against diseases that definitely cause a lot of suffering and cost the global economy a great deal of money. So I see no reason why we should not be able to develop vaccines that are much better against seasonal flu and against common cold, among other things. And of course, we should not only be talking about vaccines, we should be talking about antibiotics. You know, there's massive research out there that could be ways to develop completely new families of antibiotics, especially derived from bacteria that cannot be cultured in the laboratory, and which would be the way to eliminate the problem of multi-drug resistance, for example. So, yeah, I certainly believe that we need far more medical research in these relatively traditional areas as well. And yes, of course, it would have an impact on the health of the elderly.
Okay, great. So Yosei asks, doesn't cellular reprogramming contradict your theory? If you can epigenetically change the age of a cell, how do you reconcile cellular reprogramming with your theory of damage? And I assume he's referring to the information theory of aging posited by David Sinclair and elucidated in his recent book, which you mentioned earlier.
Okay, so first of all, let me dispose of the idea that this is any kind of theory. We do know that the human body is a machine, and that's all we need to know that its structure determines its function. In other words, that damage repair will work if we can do it. The only question is, how difficult is it to do it? So if we come back to the question about what does cellular reprogramming tell us about this, let me start with cellular reprogramming in cell culture. What happens there when we express, for example, the Yamanaka factors, is we do not simply retrace the differentiation process, pathway, sequence of events that turned a one-celled embryo or an embryonic stem cell into a differentiated cell. What we do is we eliminate the differentiation marks, essentially the epigenetic state of the cell, and we essentially wipe the slate clean. We take the cell back in the same way that the DNA of the original gametes is wiped to create the substrate for initial embryonic development in the actual embryo. Now, that's not rejuvenation, because you and I are not made of embryonic stem cells. We are made of differentiated cells. So it would in fact be an extremely bad idea simply to quote, rejuvenate the body by this means. And in fact, the first investigation of reprogramming in vivo in an actual animal was not designed to do that. Manuel Serrano in Spain simply expressed these things from transgenes, and he was expecting to see the development of teratomas and other problems, and that's exactly what he did see. You know, basically cells being inappropriately young. In other words, being too young so that they didn't know how to do their job in the body. So what's happened since then, and the person who's done the most work in this is the Belmonte lab at the Stork, is to express the same Yamanaka factors just a little bit, just transiently and periodically, so as to kind of nudge cells that are still almost stem cells back into a somewhat more stem-like state. And that could potentially have benefit. I personally believe, however, that it's likely to be a bit of a non-starter therapeutically, because the adult body is full not only of a wide variety of different differentiated cells, but also a wide variety of different mutated cells, cells that have accumulated spontaneous mutations throughout life. And a number of those cells will be only 1 or 2 steps away from becoming cancerous. And this de-differentiation that we may do is, I believe, quite likely to push a small subset of such cells into being full-blown cancerous. This is something that's very hard to validate directly in the laboratory, because such cancers would take a long time to develop. But that doesn't mean it's not true, and it does mean that it would be a big problem for using this therapeutically. David Sinclair, as you say, has also got into this. There's a number of people who have, and it's possible that we may be able to do it safely. I think if we do it safely, it will be by use of other genes. And in fact, the company Jack mentioned at the beginning that I work for a company called Ajax Therapeutics. That's actually not true anymore. I ceased working for them early this year. But yeah, they are probably the furthest along in identifying ways that we might be able to de-differentiate cells in a manner that had less chance of causing cancer. So it's not out of the question, but it's difficult, and it's definitely in no way incompatible with the concept of damage repair.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess with epigenetic reprogramming or partial epigenetic reprogramming, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because of the potential for teratomas. And I think that Sebastian Brunmeier, who I think is in the call today, who spoke last week, also mentioned the challenges associated with this sort of therapeutic approach. So I guess my question would be to you, Aubrey, which is, what do you think are the most promising strategies? Do you think senolytics are most promising? Like, what do you think will be the first anti-aging drugs that the FDA approves that we will all be able to start taking? Will it be senolytics? Will it be mTOR inhibitors?
So the difficulty in answering that question arises from the fact that damage repair is a divide and conquer approach, which means that something like an mTOR inhibitor, which is basically a calorie restriction mimetic, and I briefly mentioned them during my talk, those things may have a very pleiotropic, very widespread, comprehensive effect, but it'll be a small effect because it's simply eliciting pathways that the body already has, and that it just doesn't elicit on its own because it doesn't have the right priority. Whereas rejuvenation, damage repair, means doing stuff that the body is completely unable to do on its own. However, damage repair has to be done comprehensively as well in order to hit the jackpot. So when we do one type of damage repair, like for example, eliminating senescent cells, we would not expect to see very much benefit globally. Actually, the good news is that we do see more benefit globally than I would have expected. We always knew that there would be a certain degree of crosstalk between the types of damage. In other words, if you fix one type of damage, then you somehow make things a little bit less stressful for the body. And so the processes the body has that minimize the rate of accumulation of other types of damage, those processes work a little bit better, and the rate of accumulation of other types of damage is slightly retarded. The magnitude of that crosstalk is bigger than I would have expected, and senolytics therefore have a bigger effect than I would have expected on aging in general. But still, you need to fix everything, or else you will die more or less on schedule.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it sounds like you know, because of the crosstalk and the interconnectedness, because of the of the hallmarks, you really need like a suite of therapies to target most or
Yeah.
all of the 7 in tandem to really get that life extension and rejuvenation. Okay, cool. So we'll look at a few more questions. So David asks, is there another bright spot from the COVID experience, which is that vaccines have been developed in an unprecedentedly fast way, showing that medical progress can accelerate when public interest is expressed strongly?
So, David, you're absolutely right. Of course, it's extremely good news that we have been able to develop vaccines for COVID in less than a year. I think there's a long way to go. There's no question that if we had been prepared in advance, we could have done it a lot faster than that. And of course, everyone now knows that. So there will be infrastructure put in place so that the next pandemic will be responded to much more rapidly than this one was. But you're quite right. That's one of the many lessons that, that humanity will have learned from this pandemic. And our role right now, our job, is to make sure that those lessons are learned in the most effective way. So what I was focusing on, of course, was how to get people to understand that rejuvenation is going to pay for itself and it's really worth doing. There's a danger that rejuvenation of the immune system itself will get an unduly undue amount of the attention and at the expense of rejuvenation in general. And so we do definitely need to emphasize this crosstalk I mentioned earlier, that ultimately the only way you're going to be able to rejuvenate the immune system a lot is by rejuvenation of the body overall.
Great, thanks for that, Aubrey. So Shirley asks, based on your current research and the timeline and rate of progress currently, what is your estimate on how long you will live or people your age will live?
So, of course, that's kind of the wrong question because of longevity escape velocity. So if we reach a point that where we're improving the comprehensiveness of these therapies faster than time is passing, then that means that people who are always getting the latest therapies will never accumulate enough damage to make them sick. And once we reach longevity escape velocity, there is no way in hell that we're ever going to fall below it again. You know, even if we have a really bad century sometime in the future, there's no way that we're going to end up going so slowly that everybody dies anyway. Therefore, we really need to talk about this as a tipping point where there will be a certain set of people who are not going to make the cut, you know, who die or they become, you know, at death's door before these therapies really arrive. And those people will live only slightly longer than people live today. And then people only slightly younger than that will, essentially, you can't put a number on it because the longevity will be a function of aspects of life that do not have to do with how long ago you were born.
Mm. And I think many of us who are familiar with your work are crossing our fingers, hoping that we've made the cut to LEV. So Olaf asks, why is it good for the economy if people grow older?
It's good for the economy if people grow older for a bunch of reasons, actually. First one is, the only way that people will grow older is by not getting sick. And being sick is really, really expensive. The overwhelming majority of the medical budget of the world, including the developing world even now, is on the health problems of late life, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, simply because they kill you slowly. So people end up in a bad state of health, economically a burden on society for a long time. Of course, the burden is much greater than simply the expense of the medicines. It also means the kids of the elderly are much less productive because they're spending time looking after their sick parents. It means that the elderly themselves are no longer contributing well to society. So any way you look at it, these, any ability to keep people healthy late in life will pay for itself very, very rapidly, very many times over.
Great. So I think in one of your videos, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, you predicted we would reach, I think, robust rejuvenation in mice by 2030, mid-2030s, if that's correct. But Brian asks, when do you think the current LEV threshold is, or where do you think the current LEV threshold is, based on your predictions, based on the current state of the research?
Yeah, I'm putting it at around 16 years now, 16 years from now. So of course, that is the time frame within which I feel we have a 50% chance of reaching LEV. And I always have to emphasize, though it's pretty obvious, that that's extraordinarily speculative because any pioneering technology is, and therefore I would certainly still say that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't make it to longevity escape velocity for 100 years. I just point out that, so what? 50% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for. Now, perhaps more important than the current number is how that number has been changing over time. So when I first started giving time frame estimates, that was around 2003, 2004, and I was saying maybe 25 years from then. And of course, that means that we haven't gone as rapidly as I would have hoped. But the enormously good news is the only reason we haven't rapidly is because of lack of funding. And that problem has substantially gone away in recent years. So if you look at how my time frame estimates have been changing, in, let's say, 2005, I was saying 25 years. In 2010, I was still saying 25, 24, 23 years. It wasn't really going down very much. In 2015, things started getting better. And now we're really not slipping anymore at all. We're pretty much staying where I wanted us to be because the money problem has largely gone away as a result of the emergence of the private sector investment interest. And the parts that have still got to be funded by philanthropy or by the government, those ones are within only a year or two or three of also becoming investable. So that's why I'm much more optimistic now and why we're not slipping anymore.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So Jesse asks, how can students get involved?
So many ways. So, well, first of all, if you're an undergraduate, then the right thing to do is to get into the right field. Now, a large part of what that means is do not specialize too early. Aging, aging affects the body at every level of organization. So you have to be a pretty competent geneticist and molecular biologist and cell biologist and physiologist. You have to really cover the bases, at least, at a basic level. So get a general biology degree. In terms of what to do next, of course, there are many choices. If you're the kind of person who likes to do research, you do a PhD, then, pick a field that, first of all, you're really passionate about, because you need to be passionate to get through those long periods of frustration when your experiments are not working. But also, of course, pick a field that has relevance to rejuvenation. If you want help, write to us, write to me. I can totally help on that. There are many other routes, though, that can help. If you've already heard a lecture from Sebastian Aguiar or Sebastian Brunemeyer, he's gone into investment. He's done it extremely well. He started out on the biology side. He did an internship with us over the summer, I think in 2014. And then he moved into the finance side, and he's been able to combine the two very effectively. And he's not the only one who's taken that kind of route. So, there are many, many ways to get involved. It just depends what your talents are.
Great. And I think that's very well received for many of our Oxford attendees who maybe are looking at this field that seems very unknown to them and thinking about how they can participate to bring forward the rate at which we get to LEV, which is what I think many of us, now that if we're familiar with this concept, are very much hoping for. So Mitchell is asking a question about the ECM, the extracellular matrix, and Mitchell asks, degradation of the chondroitin sulfate proteoglycans of the ECM has had beneficial results in many tissues. Where are the main gaps in knowledge concerning ECM cross-link degradation?
Okay, so this is a complicated question. So degrading proteins overall is generally not the way that we try to go about rejuvenating the extracellular matrix. What we prefer to do is what Mitchell mentions at the end of his question, namely breaking down the cross-links that accumulate non-enzymatically between proteins of the ECM as a result of reactions with sugars. There's been good progress recently in this. We're very proud that we were able to do some of the really pioneering work, and that has actually led to one of our spin-out companies, Revel Pharmaceuticals, which is working on removing a cross-link or breaking a cross-link called glucosapine, which appears to be the most abundant in many human tissues. But there's plenty more work to do. There are things we don't know about other cross-links about whether we've even identified them yet. We have a project going on actually at the Babraham Institute outside of Cambridge, trying to identify new cross-links that have simply been overlooked because the methods for finding cross-links were insufficiently hypothesis-free, I guess. So yeah, there's plenty to do. And actually degrading and stimulating the resynthesis of ECM proteins is definitely an important thing. One area that we're very interested in that regard is elastin in the major arteries, especially because that certainly undergoes plenty of damage, not just cross-linking but also fraying. And it would be great if we could have greater turnover of elastin.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So Rosanna asks, she says, great talk, thanks. Have you thought of the legal consequences of treating aging as a disease? And could you suggest anyone who is working on the legal aspects of this issue?
Well, okay, so there are many legal aspects, but the place to begin and all of that is the fact that this is just medicine, right? So once someone develops something that actually has health benefits, then yes, absolutely, it needs to be made available to people, and that requires going through the regulatory process, going through clinical trials and being approved by regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration. But really, that's just the same as it is for every other medicine. The way in which it looks different is because society tends to think of aging wrongly, as I mentioned early on in my talk, doesn't tend to think of it as like diseases. But that's changing. The FDA, for example, and their counterparts around the world, they're not stupid people. They are knowledgeable. And they are working with people like myself to develop language that allows the regulatory process to proceed for the benefit of the health of the elderly, just as the same way that it does for medicines that address things that are recognized as regular diseases.
Great. So Linus asks, what are the 3 top things that anyone can do to further the cause of defeating aging?
I don't really have much to say over and above what I said a couple of questions ago about what students can do. There's a lot more than 3, but it depends who you are. The right thing to do always is to focus on what you're good at, what you're in a position to do, and especially on things that you are in an unusual position to do. In other words, things that not many other people are in a position to do. That's the way to determine how you can make the most difference.
So Jacob asks, what do you think the role of AI will be in reaching longevity escape velocity?
Well, it's already playing a big role. The use of AI, AI, machine learning over the past few years has, of course, gone through the most extraordinary transformation. It's being applied absolutely everywhere. And absolutely, it is amenable, it's applicable to medical research same as anything else. So, for example, drug discovery, the discovery of ways to repurpose existing drugs in new ways. These are really major areas that can be used. There are companies in this space absolutely in the longevity arena. Has linked with Oxford, a company called Nuchido, and is using machine learning in a rather innovative way based on some very distinctive and pioneering research originally done in Newcastle. But that's just one example. There are quite a few companies doing this.
Yeah, great. And I really hope that if we can develop AI alongside our existing efforts, that maybe AGI or some advanced AI could be an X factor to help us with our drug discovery. So there's a very interesting question here from Bob, which is a hypothetical question. Let's say someone is watching this video in 50 years and we haven't achieved anything even close to longevity escape velocity, yet we're also still around, no global catastrophe. If this happens, what factors would this person from the future be most likely to cite as the reasons why we never developed meaningful rejuvenation therapies?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting hypothetical question, as questions go. Well, I guess the only way we can really answer that is by looking back at the trajectory of other technologies and asking what happened then. So, optimists often talk about powered flight. as an example of, when experts were saying, oh, this is theoretically impossible, right up until it was done in the early 1900s. And that's true. But, of course, it's not necessarily the case that experts are always over-pessimistic and someone comes along and thinks of a new idea and suddenly it's all sweetness and light. You can also use powered flight in the opposite way and go back to Leonardo da Vinci, who I think we can be fairly sure that he thought that it was not going to take 400 years for his designs for powered flight to actually come to fruition. So we just don't know. But at the end of the day, the answer whenever any technology takes a lot longer to develop than people originally thought, the answer tends to be in the detail. Things are discovered that constitute obstacles. And the fact that SENS, as it currently stands, is standing the test of time is therefore quite strong circumstantial evidence that we're on the right track and that it won't take all that long. 20 years is a long time not to find anything out, especially since I've been making a serious nuisance of myself and, challenging my colleagues really quite aggressively to show why this isn't going to work, and I'm still getting away with it.
Yeah, well, that's quite an optimistic answer, and I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that we do make the progress that we're anticipating. So Ilya asks, do you think there are potentially a lot of geriatrics researchers who are actually doing aging/damage repair research without realizing it? It's hard to imagine what they are doing with all that money because it seems like aging is the only logical pathway to stopping these pathologies. Before knowing about you, I always implicitly assumed that the whole world was already doing damage repair.
Yes. I kind of assumed that before I got into aging. Well, okay, first of all, let me slightly rephrase the question and take out the word geriatrics researchers. There are certainly a lot of researchers who are actually doing damage repair research without realizing, or at least without emphasizing it. Because, sure, I mean, when I started talking about SENS, about the idea of bringing together this panel of technologies to repair different types of damage, a large part of the reason why it took a while for me to persuade my colleagues that this was sensible was that I was bringing in technologies that were being developed for completely different reasons. Some of them not even medical. So, for example, one huge part of SENS involves the identification of enzymes in other species, especially in bacteria, that are able to break down substances that we do not have enzymes to break down. And that actually was an idea that was stolen from environmental decontamination, nothing medical at all. So yeah, that kind of thing happens. And sure, there's plenty of money in it. But of course, if you don't know, if you're not focusing on aging as the main target in the end, then you will tend not to prioritize the right thing. You'll look in different places. Gene therapy is a great example of this. So there's been plenty of people working in gene therapy for a long, long time now. But most of the research has been on the relatively low-hanging fruit, on diseases where if you correct the genome of 1% of the cells in the liver, for example, then you will basically cure the disease. So that's great for those people who suffer from that disease, but it takes away emphasis from research that could be more generic.
Yeah, it's something I've thought about, and it's really interesting to hear a perspective about how to what extent other fields can contribute. So it sounds like there can be some instances where there is some relevance, but having more funding in the field itself, and certainly having more people looking at aging as the goal, as the root cause of the diseases, is going to accelerate the rate of progress. Sorry. So Ilya has another question, which is, we saw a study in 2018 from the Mayo Clinic showing a 38% increase in mice's average lifespan when administered dasatinib and quercetin. Is there any reason we shouldn't see a similarly sized increase in a human population sample? Since a senolytic is not a calorie restriction mimetic, it would seem less likely for there to be a diminishment in effect when the drug is applied to a larger organism.
So I think, Ilya, you don't mean a larger organism, you mean a longer lived organism. But other than that, your question is spot on. You're absolutely right. I think that it is absolutely the case that rejuvenation therapies that fix just one type of damage should have if not a proportionate effect in terms of longevity on long-lived and short-lived species, at least an effect that's considerably closer to proportionate than what we see for calorie restriction mimetics. So yes, I'm very optimistic. Now, it takes time, but a large part of the reason why Unity Biotechnology was able to receive, I think, $300 million in funding before they even began their first clinical trial was precisely this, that people understood that rejuvenation is a big deal. And it'll be a little while yet before we know. Those of you who've been following Unity Biotechnology will be aware that the second trial, the phase 2 trial for their drug focused on osteoarthritis, was a complete flop. There's a lot of explanations for that in terms of maybe they had too much of a placebo effect, maybe it was really not the right target. They made their decisions about what to work on basically in order, in response to the regulatory environment. In other words, they had to take an indication where safety was very unlikely to be an issue because of the local administration. But yes, I think that when we do, let's say, the first clinical trial for a senolytic that really works well in mice, and it's applied systemically, that all bets are off. We could see quite an interesting level of rejuvenation. Of course, the magnitude of lifespan extension will not be something that we can actually evaluate very quickly, or we'll be able to evaluate is the near-term impact on mortality rates. But if the clinical trial is done large, with a wide variety of different people of different ages and with different levels of pre-existing conditions, then we could end up getting really good news. I just don't want to rely on it yet.
So Ajantha asks, what are the startups, ideas, breakthroughs that have made you most excited recently?
Sorry, you're saying startup breakthroughs, so breakthroughs in the private sector. Is that what the question says?
Yeah, so it says startups / ideas / breakthroughs.
Okay, so right. So I would say actually my answer is not just one thing. Rather, the thing that most excites me is the diversity itself. The fact that we've got this explosion of investment, the startups that need investment, and in terms of the investors that are providing it, and everything is being covered. You've got literally more than a dozen companies just working on senolytics, for example. You've got absolutely everything. That is so important because it means that the field is not vulnerable to bad luck. I mentioned a moment ago that Unity had this flop. And sure, yeah, Unity's share price took a pounding, but the other companies in this space are still being invested in, and indeed, Unity themselves have a lot of money in the bank. They've got plenty of other clinical trials going on. So we are really completely safe from any repetition of what happened with gene therapy 20 years ago, when there was one piece of bad luck, one teenager who got anaphylactic shock as a result of the therapy he got, and the whole field was set back enormously. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, so it's nice that we have a kind of diversified portfolio from a longevity biotech sort of perspective, and in terms of hope for the future of reaching LEV. So we'll go through 3 more questions and then we'll conclude the talk. So Vedang asks, is there any hope of democratizing a solution to aging? If your research is successful, I would think that the focus would rapidly shift from the lab to the boardrooms and the courtrooms and beyond. Wars have been fought over less.
Yeah, so you really don't need to worry too much. I mean, of course, the basis for such a concern ultimately comes from what we see in today's medicine. Today's high-tech medicine especially is expensive to deliver, and sure enough, access to it is limited by ability to pay. I live in the US now where we don't even have public healthcare, but that's not really the point. The point here is, even in a socialized healthcare system with a single payer, that limitation still exists. So we have to ask, why is that permitted? Why do we allow that limitation of access to exist? And of course, the answer is that medicines for the elderly today more or less don't work, and therefore the perceived benefit of access to them is limited. We only extend people's low quality life by a little bit if we're lucky. medicines that do work, it won't be like that. You know, people will not be willing to put up with a scenario in which only the wealthy have access to them. And even if we ignore the humanitarian or indeed the electoral imperative of making access universal, even though it may require a lot of front loading of money, nevertheless, we can simply look at the economic imperative, the fact that the aging is so expensive, as I was mentioning earlier, and these therapies will pay for themselves incredibly quickly. So, of course, there will need to be a bunch of negotiation to make sure that people who have patents on this or that are able to actually profit from them, but that won't be a problem at all. And moreover, all of that negotiation and equitable distribution of profit will shake down before the therapies come along, because we're already in a world, we're about to be in a world anyway, in which everybody knows that these therapies are coming. So it's just, you know, there's going to be time to make sure that the front loading of investment actually does occur in time.
So another question from Bob, which I think is an interesting one. Given your confidence in achieving LEV, at least for those of us younger than middle age, would you still recommend young people sign up for cryonics, or is it a waste of time and money for them?
Ah, that's an excellent question. So, yeah, so many of you may know that I'm a strong advocate of cryonics. I believe that it's, you know, a very neglected area. It's got the potential to really save lives. There's an enormous amount of research that needs to be done to improve the quality of cryopreservation, in other words, to reduce the amount of damage that is done by the cryopreservation process. That research is criminally underfunded. And so, to be honest, you know, I would say that one of the biggest reasons for youngsters to sign up to be cryopreserved is precisely that by signing up, you're paying money into this small community of people who are developing technologies that have the potential to save an enormous number of lives. So I would not necessarily say that there is a motivation to sign up to be cryopreserved, or at least not much of a motivation for oneself. Though of course it's possible, you know, in the same way that it makes sense to store one's own stem cells when one is young. There may be near-term reasons that just happen to a small number of people why it may be necessary in the near term, irrespective of aging. But the aging reason is mainly humanitarian.
Yeah, so it's, I guess it's sort of, you know, subsidizing other people, or you know, contributing to the field, getting more money in cryonics so that they can develop the technologies and maybe help our parents or our grandparents to eventually reach LEV in some way, which may or may not involve a temporary kind of death in suspended animation. So we'll leave you with one more question, which is from Martin, who asks, what are you doing yourself to slow down your own aging?
Yeah, people ask me that a lot. I'm afraid the right thing to do is to do as I say rather than what I do, because on the one hand, I don't get nearly enough sleep, which is definitely bad for me. But also, you know, I'm one of those repulsively lucky people. I'm just well built. So every time I get my biological age measured in one way or another, I always come out way, way younger than I actually am. And I don't even, I can eat and drink more or less what I like and nothing happens. And I don't even need much exercise. So for me, it's the case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. I have to be quite conservative. But in general, I would say the right advice is simply to pay attention to your body and do what seems to work for you.
Great. Maybe to supplement your advice, we can read David Sinclair's book as well. I know he's got a lot to say on the topic of personal longevity strategies with NMN and so on. On behalf of the Oxford Society of Aging...
Yeah, when I'm feeling flippant, I tend to say that I now have an extra reason not to write a sequel to my own book, as he decided to do it himself. I would like to say to everybody, I see that there are dozens and dozens of questions that we didn't have time to get through. So it's perfectly acceptable to write me an email, any of you. We're pretty good at answering them. You may not get the answer from me, or at least not immediately, but please feel free to write.
Great, thank you, Aubrey. So on behalf of the Oxford Society of Aging and Longevity, we'd like to thank you for this brilliant speech and Q&A. I think there's a lot of value that all of us can take away from Aubrey's talk. And I think it's valuable if we can also share some of this knowledge to our friends and help to build a community of longevity enthusiasts. As I think Anya may have mentioned at the beginning, our next speaker event is featuring David Wood, who I believe was also in attendance today, and he'll be talking more about the philosophical and the kind of social implications of a population of individuals who have access to rejuvenation therapy. So if you've thought about overpopulation, immortal dictators, distributional justice, any of these as potential concerns or issues, come along next week at the same time. And David Wood will be presenting some well thought out rebuttals to these objections.